Welcome to Scholars and Saints, the University of Virginia Mormon Studies podcast. Scholars and Saints is brought to you by support from the Richard Lyman Bushman Endowed Professorship of Mormon Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. Music for this episode is provided by Ben Howington. To hear more, visit mormonguitar.com. On Scholars and Saints, we'll explore some of the most pressing issues and cutting-edge methods in Mormon studies and put them in conversation with scholarship from the discipline of religious studies. You might be wondering, what is Mormon studies? Mormon studies refers to the broad interdisciplinary efforts of scholars both within and outside of the Latter-day Saint movement to understand the legacy of the religion founded by Joseph Smith Jr. in 1830. Mormonism includes well-known branches like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as well as hundreds more. Today, on our first episode, we explore Mormon ideas about the end of the world. In his recent book, Terrible Revolution, Latter-day Saints and the American Apocalypse, Christopher James Blythe argues that Latter-day Saint apocalyptic prophecy has changed over time. What began as the expectation of an imminent apocalypse in early Mormonism changed in the early 20th century as Latter-day Saints in the United States returned from isolation in the Rocky Mountains to become culturally American again. Dr. Blythe reveals how change and adaptation have been driven by tensions between lay and official prophecy and the relationship of church and nation. For questions or comments about this or any episode, email me at mormonstudies@virginia.edu. Christopher James Blythe joins us today to talk about his new book, Terrible Revolution, Latter-day Saints and the American Apocalypse, recently published with Oxford University Press. Dr. Blythe received his PhD in Religious Studies from Florida State University and currently serves as a research associate at Brigham Young University's Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship and as a co-editor of the Journal of Mormon History. Thanks for joining us today, Chris.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I really appreciate it.
So, Chris, one of the contributions that Terrible Revolution makes to Mormon studies is in its use of a method called lived religion, which is a method in religious studies that really becomes popular in the 1990s under great scholars like David Hall and Robert Orsi. And it makes use of social science tools like participant observation and ethnography from the disciplines of anthropology and sociology and the like. And really, the idea behind this is getting at how people actually practice and make meaning with religious symbols, as opposed to how institutions might represent themselves. And as we know, at least for much of its history, Mormon studies has been dominated by what we might call traditional archival history. But you shake this up a bit, and you use folklore studies to really nuance the ways we hear historical narratives. So tell us more about that.
I think Latter-day Saint scholars have often just been attracted to this sort of official narratives and stories of major figures. You know, we have these great biographies of church leaders that are very popular. We have, the moments like the practice of polygamy, the end of polygamy, Mormons and politics. All of these ideas gained a great deal of popularity. And also, of course, the life of Joseph Smith. If someone was going to buy one book on Mormonism, chances are they're buying a book on Joseph Smith. And so that sort of official narrative or the story of leaders is what has been so crucial in that first, half century of Mormon studies. I think Mormonism itself polices official doctrine. And so historians have to do a little more work, perhaps, in a sense of having people, really what we have to do is dig into more sources. We have to be willing to do ethnography. We have to be willing to look into sources, and some sources that have been considered strange, or, there's all sorts of ways that Latter-day Saints have policed what is orthodox and what's bizarre, what's folklore, what's a rumor. And so what I try to do in this book is to go into items that were once very mainstream, not that they were well accepted amongst church leaders, but were widely distributed, ideas that were very popular amongst the laity. And I try to track those ideas down by reading a ton of diaries, many of them that we don't see quoted very often. And I also read against the grain of official sources. So if I had, a great talk from a church leader that said, stop teaching this idea, well, then I didn't read that talk to say, look, Latter-day Saints stopped teaching this idea. I read that talk to say, here was a major idea that was prevalent and church leaders had to respond to it. And so I think reading against the grain is one of the key ways to bring out lay voices in the church. But also, there's just an amazing untapped series of diaries and correspondence that we need to read, and we need to go beyond family histories and biographies as we study these things. And so I hope I'm not the only person to attempt lived religion in Latter-day Saint studies, but I do hope this book introduces that approach to more scholars.
So as you've mentioned, the tension between lay voices and official voices among Latter-day Saints is pretty central to your book. So do you find the same sorts of institutional resistance to lay apocalyptic, lay prophecy in other Mormon movements like the Community of Christ?
Yeah, you know what? I actually think you do. So in Community of Christ, Joseph Smith III, who founds the movement who takes over the movement in the mid and late 19th century, is going to police all sorts of ideas. And he's going to police ideas like the gathering. Here's an idea that was very prevalent and even official in the broader Mormon movement. But he's policing those ideas among his laity. What's the place of the temple in the last days, the building of Zion? Well, Joseph Smith III is policing that really strictly, even at the same time that there are certain settings, just like in the LDS church in the 19th century, where people are able to share prophecy and vision. However, those ideas are going to get regulated by church leaders. And that's true even in Mormon fundamentalist communities, where I argue that really apocalypticists have found refuge, have kind of made those movements have emerged from apocalyptic movements just as much as they've emerged from the continued practice of polygamy. But even in those communities, leaders often police at least the details of how the apocalyptic is supposed to occur. And those debates are really common. I was attending, doing ethnography in one polygamous community a decade ago. And in their meetings, there was a debate as people talked about different places they wanted to locate, building little settlements. And they talk about, I remember a young man getting up and saying, some people debate whether this is just like, a place we're living or this is a place of refuge. And I think it's a place of refuge. And he went there. So the debate and the place of leadership policing it is pretty universal, because the Latter-day Saint tradition is, in almost all varieties I can think of, is based on hierarchy. It's always a present factor. And so even though lay members are encouraged to have prophetic gifts, they're often told that these gifts are for their personal lives. They're to confirm a sort of cooperative vision that the entire movement has. They're not to offer a new vision that hasn't yet been shared by the leadership.
So it seems like one of the main consequences of using a lived religion approach to Mormon history in this way is that you fracture the kinds of cohesive narratives that historians have tended to tell about the Mormon past and Mormon intellectual history before. So in the book, you talk about how Mormons over time have kind of changed the ways that they use apocalyptic based on their personal or even institutional needs. And these sorts of changes reveal what may be at times conflicting, but seem to be common themes. So you call these themes the apocalyptic master narrative, which is a fancy way of saying that these themes are sort of the sites of tension between the lay people and the church, or even between the church and the nation. So if you would sketch out for us what that apocalyptic master narrative looks like.
This is exactly what I hope people would take from the books. I really appreciate that. Fracturing these sort of cohesive narratives. That's a great way to put it. So when I turn to master narrative, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying if somebody wanted to say Latter-day Saints believes this, and they list 8 facts, I would say, well, those are 8 themes, but in actuality, you can't say these 8 facts were accepted by everyone. They're debating these ideas. These are ideas in contest. And so when I think about the ideas that are in contest, I often, we would start and we'd say Latter-day Saint tradition takes, and their master narrative takes themes from the Bible and roots them on a New World context, right? In America's context. And then from that, the master narrative pulls a variety of themes. So I would say major parts of the master narrative include the place of persecution leading to judgments from God, the idea that missionaries are being sent out to warn the world of an impending destruction and judgment, the idea that there's a racial component to the apocalypse, so the idea that Native Americans will be participating in this as part of that master narrative, the idea that the saints will gather to one location where they can be protected, the idea that there'll be a last day city, that Adam Undiaman, these sort of major events. Now, all of the details of these events are debated. You can see a variety of different appearances. The idea of an invasion on the saints and the saints responding to protect the United States, whether militarily or politically. I use the concept of political messianism to describe early Latter-day Saints. This is here an example of where it gets fuzzy because there's so many different voices trying to talk about the Latter-day Saint past and particularly Latter-day Saints in politics. And so there's been some misdata out there. And one is that did Latter-day Saints believe the Constitution was going to hang by a thread? And absolutely they did. I would say that's one of the key moments of this master narrative, that Latter-day Saints are going to be a savior to the nation. And then at the end of all this, after all these destructions, which include plagues and earthquakes and diseases and fighting and race wars, and eventually people fleeing to the Rocky Mountains, all sorts of different moments. At the very end of this, there is a restructuring of power where Latter-day Saints who once saw themselves as oppressed, including actually Native Americans in some of this, will rise to be the governing class in a new society. And others who want to participate in this will have fled from their violent environments and found peace amongst the saints. And gradually, this millennial event will come along and there'll be peace on earth. And all the events that you read in Isaiah or Ezekiel, this is a new world. And that, in short, is the master narrative. So I set that up just in the first chapter. And then in the other chapters, I try to go at how that master narrative can shift when new events in everyday life cause for adaptation.
Yeah, and one of the critical changes that occurs, particularly toward the end of the 19th century, is that this concept of gathering is no longer localized to the West, to the Rocky Mountains, right? The diffusion and I guess you could call it the Latter-day Saint diaspora. We start building temples outside of Utah. People start relocating to eastern cities again, which you point out had, previously been thought to be the first sites of destruction during the apocalypse. And so this requires a rethinking of what the apocalypse will entail. If we are no longer physically protected, how do we think about the end times?
That's right. I think that is one of the major key moments. And what I argue is that things become a lot more vague, right? The second we view ourselves as good Americans, I argue that Latter-day Saints left the nation, and even though there was long quests for statehood and things like that, they deliberately wanted to leave the eastern United States. They saw themselves as true Americans for sure, but they were abandoning the nation because they thought it was so dangerous, that these were their persecutors and whether they would be persecuted themselves by them or God was going to vanquish their persecutors. In either case, they did not want to be there to see that come about. And so, yeah, I think at those moments where you have to rethink this, now you're a good American, you don't want to view other Americans as your persecutors, at least in the same sense. And you don't want to, you don't want the good people you're sending to Boston and New York City to think that they're, any day now they need to flee for the Rocky Mountains again. So you see, instead of church leaders just specifically unwriting what they once taught, I argue that they point towards folk visions, the folk visions that were once so popular at the time. Even though church leaders were saying the same thing, they would point to folk visions and say, well, this one's not true. And in doing that, it sort of undercuts some of that apocalyptic expectations, the imminence and the specific ideas. Yeah, absolutely. Our becoming intellectually, culturally Americans and geographically diverse changes everything.
One of the other consequences of early 20th century adaptation to changing cultural conditions in Mormon Apocalyptic is this diminished role of Native Americans in prophecy. And in the book, you talk about how early Mormons believe that Native Americans are going to play this crucial role in the apocalypse, even including building the New Jerusalem in America, punishing the Gentile whites. But as Mormons become mainstreamed into American culture, you argue this goes away. So tell us more about the role of Native Americans in 19th century prophecy and then how that's changed over time.
Hickman's fantastic article, which I'm not going to attempt to remember the title of right now, but maybe you can put it in the show note, is brilliant and leads us to rethink the Book of Mormon and its place in telling the story of Native Americans, not only participating in this sort of, early Latter-day Saints were thinking of Native Americans in a few ways. One, they thought of Native Americans playing a role in building the New Jerusalem, and they also believed that Native Americans would have uprisings, that they would turn against Gentile peoples, the United States government, different states, and through violence would punish them for the things that they'd done, both against Native Americans, but also against Mormons. Hickman invites us to think more about different elements of that as it shows up in the Book of Mormon. And he relates it to nativist prophets of the time who are predicting a better world for Native peoples, and include even some of those elements, sometimes of violence, as it might relate to that turning of the tide. So whether Mormons understand it or not, they're actually tying into a larger apocalyptic lens that's been playing out on American soil at the time, and would continue even after their founding. So this becomes very important, especially to early Latter-day Saints. I think it's important that in Kirtland in the 1830s, as people convert, they speak in the gift of tongues and they believe they're speaking native languages, and they enact parts of the Book of Mormon. And one of the things that one reporter says people are enacting in these sort of revival meetings is they are doing a stereotype mimicking of sort of Native American attacks, as if they have a tomahawk and things like that. Because this event of Native American an uprising was important to them. And in the 1832 or 1833, Joseph writes a letter in which he tells the saints to stop talking so much about it. That this is exactly the sort of emphasis on the apocalypse that's going to make people not trust us. It's going to scare our neighbors. And this is not what we need in Jackson County in the 1830s at the time.
So we can begin to see this tension between lay and official, even with Joseph Smith.
Yeah, well, this is something important because I think it's really indicative of 100 years later, too. Joseph Smith isn't saying he doesn't believe it. He's the one that introduced these ideas. But absolutely, he says, don't share it. Don't talk a lot about it. That's not what this is about. Outsiders are going to be offended if you say, just you wait. Lots of Native Americans are going to come. And you see that throughout Joseph's lifetime and later on, where lay Latter-day Saints will write letters to family members and say they trust that Native people are being prepared for a sort of uprising against the nation. Sometimes you'll see rhetoric as if, and Brigham uses this rhetoric, as if he's controlling native peoples and he could use them at his disposal. I don't think he really could, but he made these claims to scare individuals, to scare government agents. And then relationships with native peoples become more tense and complex. And we see a lot more ethnocentrism than we ever saw. It's always there, the stereotype that's pushed onto a people, but things get more heated in Utah. And of course, great historians are pulling that data apart. In 1890, you have the ghost dance. I think that's a key moment because we have, quickly, the ghost dance is a nativist movement in which a Paiute visionary is sharing a message that a united Native American people from all different nations will come together, and through performing this dance and other sort of ceremonies attached to it, they would be able to bring about a sort of apocalyptic event or a utopian event. It's not clear, which would usher in a new world. And that world would either, one, whites and natives would exist without tension, as one people, or where whites were wiped out. And I think ghost dance practitioners even debated on what was the case there. So Latter-day Saints heard about this movement, and knowing it was pointed against the American government, and they thought, maybe there's something there. And, ghost dance adherents claimed to have seen the Messiah. That's a complicated claim they had. And there were some Christian elements through it and second coming elements. And Mormons then got into a large conversation. Major newspaper articles written on the topic of whether the ghost dance was legitimate and who exactly the ghost dance, what they were seeing. And, what it turns out is most Mormons wanted to believe natives were this, but you can already see that they're concerned that we not think natives are the leaders, right? Natives are supposed to be under Mormons, which is something Hickman's article asks us to reconsider. Is that really the vision that the Book of Mormon gives? And so they're going to say, well, it's not possible. This is probably a true movement, but it's not possible that they saw Jesus. Jesus would come to us. They probably saw the three Nephites. And so there's that sort of taking seriously the movement, but also that nervousness that they could portray them as a violent force at the end, but not as that workers to build a new Jerusalem, workers with their own prophets and those sorts of ideas. So very complicated. In our day, the place of Native Americans and last days prophecy is definitely muted. Bruce R. McConkie in 1982 wrote his book on the apocalypse, the last sort of full official from a church leader interpretation of apocalyptic scriptures. And in that book, Millennial Messiah, he definitely downplays the role of Native Americans. Says, sure, they're going to be important, but they're under the church. This isn't an independent thing.
I think we should note that around this time, despite what McConkie is saying, the importance of Native Americans in Mormon Apocalyptic is enjoying a bit of a resurgence in a couple of ways, at least. Church President Spencer Kimball, who's in office from 73 to 85, he puts these various institutional programs in place, these racial uplift or reculturation programs that are basically, kind of resembling in some ways, what whites are doing in this sort of civilizing projects of the 19th century. But then you have George P. Lee, who's trying to craft a kind of liberation theology for natives based on the Book of Mormon. So talk to us a little bit more about this period and its role in the trajectory of Mormon Apocalyptic.
I think there's so much occurring in that moment. So we probably have a good 50 or 60 years where these ideas are completely in decline. If we're looking for Native American apocalyptic ideas, most of those have retreated to at the folk level, told us stories and families, or in Mormon fundamentalist groups where some of these ideas would still gain some prominence into the 1950s. But I think Spencer W. Kimball, grew up in Mexico, has these ideas on his mind, and will focus on Native American peoples of the United States, particularly Navajo, as he's thinking of how these prophecies could come about, the day of the Lamanite. I think George P. Lee, the first Native American general authority, we need to do some research on the impact that he had. Certainly, he's going to emphasize some of these ideas. There's a special place. He's going to emphasize that the Book of Mormon gives a special status to Native peoples. And I think people did push back on that to a level. George P. Lee became a controversial figure for other reasons too. And so I don't know, was it George P. Lee's ideas or George P. Lee's association after his excommunication with clergy abuse played into a sort of de-emphasis on some of those ideas right then after Spencer Kimball's death? I don't know, but it's definitely important in the story we tell. Nowadays, when people talk about, I just received a letter from a person who read Terrible Revolution. They said, I just struggle to believe any of these prophecies, faithful Latter-day Saint guys, struggle to believe any of these prophecies could be fulfilled in our day. And so people have different perspectives on prophecy today as it relates to Native peoples. And sometimes they're really pretty tame. Sometimes we're taking these ideas of violence associated with them and we're putting it to Latin American countries. And sometimes there's ideas that I think are racist, based in a sort of conservative American idea against immigration that suggests undocumented immigration has something to do with these philosophies. So you can see people adapting these prophecies in a variety of ways. If Orson Pratt was alive today, I assume he would just say, expect it like you've always expected it. There's going to be this remnant of people. And that idea does exist also, including in some Latter-day Saint circles. I once, a couple of years ago, I saw a group. It was a conservative Latter-day Saint conference, and the speaker was a Navajo speaker, and she got up and had everyone in the audience stand up who had Native American blood. And of course, these were white individuals standing up that had stories of, a Native ancestor, or maybe did, I don't know, but they didn't identify principally as Native people. And they all stood up, and she then said, well, this is the rise of the Native people, that their blood had dispersed. So you see all sorts, and then she led them all in 19th century hymns about Native people, the one about Brother Layman and so on, or Cousin Layman. And I was shocked. This was a really surprising moment, but it just shows how people have tried to figure out how such a prominent part of the Book of Mormon about Native American apocalypticism could fit in this modern world where so much about our apocalyptic ideas have shifted.
Chris, with the sort of racial hierarchies that 19th century Mormons put in place, I'm wondering also if we see any sorts of lay apocalyptic or lay prophecy from Black Mormons. It seems like this may have been like a potential outlet for religious expression, especially until 1978 when the priesthood and temple ban is removed. So, do we know anything about that?
The short answer is I don't know of a Black Mormon who shared much of these ideas, with the exception of William McCary back in the 1840s, where he's certainly building apocalyptic ideas and inserting himself as a sort of messianic figure in those ideas. This figure Black Pete that we know very little about in the 1830s in Kirtland, some scholars believe introduced sort of charismatic practices occurring in Kirtland at the time. If that's true, then he had an impact on the apocalyptic fervor of the 1830s, particularly this, I already mentioned sort of pantomiming Native American apocalypticism. And so that was a moment in which people believe Black Pete may have participated. So there's a few spots we can talk about. I think we'd find more as we dig into more of those sources and we do oral histories and so on. I mean, right now would be a great time to do it. There's some hits of things. Not all end times prophecies are the sort of apocalyptic stuff I focus on. I think of, the basic message of Latter-day Saints living in the last days and being an elect people, coming out of a certain time, is certainly a millenarian or millennial idea And so I think about Darius Gray's revelation, which he brought to President Hinckley and tells us that President Hinckley told him he could share it, would be an example of a vernacular revelation. And the revelation that he said he had was that African peoples weren't cursed, but that they had a calling. And so here were a people set apart with a special calling to the nation. And that resonates, here's a still living African-American man. I mean, that resonates with the 19th century to me, pinpointing a racial group and saying they have a special mission and sharing that particularly with that group to give them hope and meaning. Yeah, I would think he's a great example of an older tradition, even though it's not a story of destructions of the land.
So you discuss at length various permutations on what you call the Constitution prophecy, which has been historically confused with the more well-known White Horse prophecy. So we see this coming up as recently as Mitt Romney's 2008 campaign, presidential campaign. And I don't know if it makes the rounds in his second campaign or not, but talk a little bit about what you're calling the Constitution prophecy, how it differs from the White Horse prophecy. And, certainly the last year in American politics, we've seen a lot of anxiety, especially on the left, but also somewhat on the right, about threats to American constitutional democracy. Do we see any resurgence of the Constitution prophecy and its use among Latter-day Saints?
Yeah. The reason I introduced this idea of the Constitution prophecy is because usually it's called the White Horse prophecy, and that confuses everything. The White Horse prophecy is a 1902 document from a man named Edwin Rushton that pulls together all sorts of different apocalyptic ideas and throws it in one document. And the church came out and said, don't trust this document, this White Horse prophecy. And one of the things the White Horse prophecy contains in it is the Constitution prophecy, the idea that the Constitution will once hang by a thread and Latter-day Saint people will defend it. The elders of Israel will defend the Constitution. This is so interesting. So somehow in the popular media, instead of it being the story about the Constitution being protected, it becomes a story about one man protecting the Constitution. I think this is because earlier, when we're talking about the Constitution prophecy, we're defending the Constitution by bringing the ideals of America to the Rocky Mountains where they can be protected from this corrupt nation. And once you now see yourself as part of that nation, how do you protect it? Well, you do it through politics. And so wouldn't it be a Latter-day Saint politician that stands up and does this? A really interesting change. And you see that, mid 20th century. But the Constitution prophecy is being promoted all the way up to Ezra Taft Benson's presidency. And he's telling people, if you want to fulfill this prophecy, go out and vote. Go out and support conservative causes and so on, where he thinks there's a place for it. I think Latter-day Saints took the Constitution prophecy much more seriously during the Cold War, where they had placed a role in defending American conservatism than they did under Romney's presidency. I've had friends who tell me I'm crazy when I say I really haven't seen an apocalyptic, the preppers that I study and the legends I collect. I don't see a lot of evidence that the average Latter-day Saint was really excited in Mitt Romney fulfilling this prophecy. Now, I think there was a certain excitement in Mitt Romney about having a Latter-day Saint out there, but mainly where I saw the White Horse prophecy invoked was in media, looking for an interesting story. And they could have had a much more interesting story if they would have known the White Horse prophecy and the Constitution prophecy were different, right? Because they'd come to Romney and say, do you believe in the White Horse prophecy? And he'd say, every prophet spoken against the White Horse prophecy. It's a folklore thing. And if you would have said, do you believe Latter-day Saints will protect the Constitution? Well, then the question would really determine whether he knows his history, right? If he was paying attention at church, 10 years before, he would know that, yeah, that is an idea. And it's an idea that was permitted all the way back to, we can show Joseph Smith teaching it in 1840. So an old idea. Now, what I see in the modern era is that people use it as a meme. Latter-day Saints on the left or the right play with it as a sort of, a meme, often humorously. Now that Mitt Romney has opposed Trump, you see people on the left saying, well, maybe he is going to fulfill this prophecy. Now, they don't really think he's fulfilling this prophecy. They're having fun with a discourse that's been out there. And it's fun. I like some of these memes where Harry Reid and Mitt Romney are fighting over the white horse, right? Who's going to be the Mormon that saves the day? It's an interesting thing. But that idea of political messianism that's undergirding all this, I think we'd find out that really is an important Latter-day Saint ideal that we can trace all the way up. And today, I see this ideal showing up amongst Latter-day Saint preppers, not in their excitement about Romney, but in their excitement, unfortunately, from my opinion, in Trump. President Trump as this sort of an individual who's pushing against mainstream political parties and responding to, liberal ideals. They see a hero in that. And Romney is presented all strangely to me as a villain in the story. And so he's a traitor. And you see that in the sort of far-right prepper groups. Of course, Latter-day Saints have all sorts of political ideals and political understandings with an emphasis on conservatism. And any of those ideas could use this sort of Constitution prophecy as fuel or as a way to reinforce that sense of mission.
Before we wrap up here, the biggest thing on all of our minds, right, is the pandemic. How has, if at all, how has the pandemic affected the way that Latter-day Saints, especially Latter-day Saints who aren't part of the official institution, how has that affected their apocalyptic?
Yeah, as a historian, I'd say we got to wait a few years to pull in all our sources, but we can see it right now with the use of the internet. My wife is the folklore archivist at BYU, and so she's been interviewing missionaries and others every day since the pandemic has been underway to record their experiences with it. What I think is that the pandemic has made us be more open to ideas that we've considered folklore, right? Latter-day Saints always believe in a sort of last days mission. Usually Latter-day Saints, the mainstream Latter-day Saint, whether they were in 1850 or in 1950, usually thought the second coming was around the corner, but not today, right? It's going to be 20 years from now or 40 years from now. I think there's a lot more emphasis on an imminent apocalypse. And what I see this in is a series of YouTube videos, some put out by a man named Masayoshi Montemayor, a woman named Jody Stoddard, and there are others that have gotten hundreds of thousands of views. And they're all predicting major events are happening both this year and in just a few years. And they're doing it not through visionary practices, but through sort of like biblical calculation and putting different quotes together, relating it to evangelical prophecy conversation on the eclipses and blood moons and so on. So there's an openness to this and certainly an interest to it. I have gotten dozens of phone calls from different Latter-day Saint members asking what I think of these videos and telling me how they've, heard about these videos. A seminary teacher called me from Logan and said, Chris, my golfing buddy, just gave me this video. What do you think about this? I have a friend in Salt Lake who's a realtor, told her, went through this whole hour video step by step with her to educate her about it. So there is a lay emphasis on these ideas now that we haven't seen otherwise. And there's some excitement, I think home church is fascinating as a moment of our time. But also, if I was writing a novel on the apocalypse, home church is one of the things I would include in that novel, right? How are Latter-day Saints bringing things when they have to be away from society? And I think we're open to it. We are getting a taste of how an apocalypse might be. So it's pretty fascinating.
Chris, this has been a great discussion. Thanks for being with us here today. But before we go, what book recommendations do you have? What are you reading right now? And also, what are you working on any projects right now that we can look forward to reading in the future?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There's several books that I'm very excited about. And in Mormon studies, I'm really excited about Sarah Patterson's Pioneers in the Attic, which takes seriously the story of, it has a folklore base to it as well, sort of lived religion, material religion, where what's the importance of this sort of pioneer memory in Latter-day Saint culture. And she takes you to all of the sites and the way Latter-day Saints are constructing their past. I'm also, related to that, Scott Eslin's book, which is entitled Return to the City of Joseph, emphasizes that memory story as it occurs in Nauvoo. Two books I'm very excited about. I am also very excited to finally dig in to Peter Coviello's Make Yourselves Gods. And so this is a book that I think is going to make waves in Mormon studies. And the little bit that I've read so far takes a while to read and process, but I think it's going to be an exciting moment for us. So I hope we're digging into those books. My own current projects, I am working on a book on Emma Hale Smith and reception among Latter-day Saints. What's happened to this widow of Joseph Smith, and how did Latter-day Saints reinterpret her? There's not a lot of sources on Emma, and so I argue that creative people through art and sculpture and song and theater, movies, literature have reimagined her in different ways for their own purposes, either as a feminist or an Orthodox church member, and a variety of other ways. It's been a lot of fun, really fascinating. But lots of great Mormon studies out there. I'm excited for this podcast, bringing attention to a lot of it.
That's Christopher James Blythe talking about his recent book, Terrible Revolution, Latter-day Saints and the American Apocalypse. Thanks for joining us today, Chris.
Thanks so much, Stephen. It's been fun.
You've been listening to Scholars and Saints, the University of Virginia Mormon Studies podcast. Today we heard about how Mormon apocalyptic ideas have changed over time. While early Mormons expected the Second Coming and its accompanying destruction any day, 20th century Mormons de-emphasized the intensity of their apocalyptic ideas and pushed back the date of the Second Coming. Today, as the world faces unprecedented crises, the imminent apocalypse is making a comeback among lay Mormons. Thanks again for listening. I hope you'll join me next time when I talk with Professor Quincy Newell of Hamilton College about her book, Your Sister in the Gospel, The Life of Jane Manning James, a 19th Century Black Mormon. You can find me on Twitter at MormonStudiesVA or by email at mormonstudies@virginia.edu. Until next time, I'm Stephen Betts.